We have a deletion of item 11K1, unresolved building deficiencies, remedial action requirements for 85 Irwin Street.
That's on page 5 of our green sheets, 85 Irwin Street, halfway down the page.
Thank you.
At this time, let me introduce our new city clerk, Joan Harrison. Welcome. Thank you. Adoption of, are there any other late items from council members? See none. A motion to adopt the agenda would be in order. Moved Councillor Unger, seconded Councillor Manhas. Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. The minutes of the regular meeting of December 17th, 2007. Moved Councillor Sherry, seconded Councillor McNabb, that they be adopted. Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor of adoption. Opposed? Carried. Presentations. Mr. Barry, City Manager, regarding the urban containment boundary recommendation in the official community plan 10-year review update. Mr. Barry, welcome, and
thank you.
It's all yours.
So we'll just take a moment here to set up. I apologize. This is going to be probably around a half an hour conversation to try to set some context for our future. Increasingly, council is called upon to act on some very complex issues, and it's an organized complexity. So often effects in one area aren't necessarily linear, and they're felt elsewhere. I've talked before to council in the budget context about the reconciliation of growth and environment being the groundwork for council. And tonight we want to set some sort of macro context around our recommendation this evening with the urban containment boundary and the city boundary. And I'd encourage your worship, council members, to feel free to ask questions and stop me as we go here. Sorry, Cam. There we go. So interestingly enough, I think we often forget as we're dealing with the many issues that are before council that we really have an integrated environment. And the city of Nanaimo is really an artificial construct, just like the other municipalities in the region. These are false lines put on the map by men and in time, and we want to look at the overall good of the area environmentally, socially, and economically. So tonight, even though I'm the City of Nanaimo manager and council is elected to represent the citizens of the City of Nanaimo, we're going to talk largely about the regional context, because it's the regional context that is most important in terms of environmental, economy, and social effect. And it's the scale of entity that council is in a position to provide leadership on. And one of the interesting things about talking about the region is it's important to get our nomenclature right. We often talk about the electoral areas that are outside the 4 incorporated municipalities, and sometimes people equate that with rural areas. Well, it just ain't so. In between Parksville and Qualicum, for instance, it is extremely urban, even though those areas aren't incorporated, and that's part of the discussion we want to have this evening. Whoops, going the wrong way, that's my problem. There we go. So this is the regional district of Nanaimo, showing the density as predicted for the future in the current regional growth management plan. The green is these artificial lines showing municipal boundaries. And the red shows where density is proposed for the future. And as you can see, it looks a little bit like measles. It's a little bit all over on a long, continuous stretch along the coast. And what we want to talk about today, which I think we could get to some reasonable agreement amongst most people on Vancouver Island. Most people come to Vancouver Island or stay on Vancouver Island because it's such a wonderful place to live. And council's challenge and the rest of our challenge is to make sure it remains that way as a wonderful place to live in the future. And we know that it won't remain a wonderful place to live if we don't deal with the status quo. Because right now, the course that we were on is further environmental degradation, further social problems, further economic problems, particularly for municipal taxpayers, as I've discussed previously in the budget presentation. And one of the things that people don't often understand, they certainly understand that there's massive change happening in the world. I don't think they necessarily understand where it's going. But one of the things they may not understand is the fact that even though all that change is taking place, our zoning bylaws have effectively not changed since the 70s. That's not John Travolta, that's Larry McNabb in the 70s, so some things have changed. So this was the challenge for council. When we did Imagine Nanaimo, a very in-depth test of what the community wanted to see in the future, we got very good insight about what the community wanted for its future in Nanaimo. We subsequently did an OCP review called Plan Nanaimo, and once again, we got very good impact. What we never did was implement the zoning changes that would actually see that vision take place. So today, even parcels that have sat fallow for the last 50 years have zoning on it that was put in place in the 70s under a different vision. A vision that I would say that was all things to all people and growth is good, bigger is better. Most of those assumptions have been proven to be false, but the zoning is still in place. So that'll be a large part of the discussion tonight that council needs to look if they're going to change the future in changing some of the rules. Larry, look good back then, eh? Still looks good. So on the status quo, I've talked to you recently fairly extensively about that we need to make environment job one, and council, that's following council's leadership actually, both at the city and at the region, in saying that climate change and environmental protection needs to be job one. Right now, clearly, I would argue that our approach is environmentally unsustainable. We're very auto-dependent. We have land use practices that were constructed in the 70s that are extremely consumptive of land. They're consumptive of water. They're consumptive of all sorts of other natural resources. In addition, the course we're on is financially unsustainable. I've done a budget presentation showing you right now that the effects of extremely inefficient development promotes free riders. It promotes unfairness with our taxpayers. And the property tax burden is growing, particularly within municipalities who are dealing with all sorts of stresses, but part of it is because of competition with areas outside the city, in areas where we'd like to protect environmentally sensitive areas, which aren't paying the full cost. So we have a problem competing with areas outside the city where it's very cheap to do development, there's very little regulation, and that means that areas that maybe would be protected in lieu of putting it into the cities and providing density, that's not happening. The third issue that's often not connected is that our current approach is socially unsustainable. We have very uneven distribution right now in terms of fairness. And increasingly the developments which we're seeing, and you'll see some tonight, have a specific lack of diversity and a specific lack of amenities. And it's pretty well documented in the literature that homogeneity kills community involvement. And we'll talk about that a bit later.
What's the worst that could happen? Have you ever found yourself saying that to someone when you're trying to convince them to do something? But I don't think I want to eat the raw sea slug. Come on, what's the worst that can happen? You don't really worry about that worst if you don't think it's going to happen. And if it does, well, you've always recovered from it in the past. That kind of thinking has worked out okay for us so far. But now, with 6 billion people and technology that might be able to change the planet, it's conceivable that there may be some worst that we can't recover from. Take global warming, for example. If you listen to the worst predictions, we may be in for a nasty future with storms, droughts, floods, epidemics, famine. But what if that worst isn't going to happen? What if it's not true, or that we're not the ones doing it? It seems like a pretty important question to figure out, what with the fate of the human race and all, which is probably why there's still some bitter fighting going on about it right now. What if I told you I think I've found an argument that makes that whole bitter question of whether it's really happening or not moot? An argument where we don't need to know whether it's true or not in order to still decide what to do or not do. An argument that leads to a conclusion that even the most hardened skeptic and the most panicked activist both can agree on. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? Well, it seems like it to me too, which is why I'm putting this argument out there to check to see if my reasoning is delusional, because frankly, no one I've shown it to so far has been able to poke a hole in it, and it leads to a conclusion I find inescapable and terrifying. So, here it is. When faced with uncertainty like we are with climate change, it becomes useful to look at the different possibilities for the future in order to be able to compare them side by side. So one of the first things to look at is whether human-caused global climate change is real or not. There are two basic possibilities, one that it turns out to be false and one that it turns out to be true. Now, this is a key point because this is where we get to set aside that whole contentious debate about whether the globe is warming and we're the ones doing it. We do that by acknowledging that no one can know with absolute certainty what the physical world will do. All reasonable people should be able to admit to the possibility that they might have a mistaken understanding about reality. So, at this point, we all agree these are both possibilities. The second thing to look at is what action on climate change do we take? Let's make column A yes for significant action and column B no for little to no significant action. What that gives us is a grid with 4 boxes, each box representing a basic scenario for the future. Let's take a look at what each of those futures might look like. The first is the future where we did take action on climate change, but climate change turned out to not be true, not be real. So what would the consequence of that be? Well, wasted money mostly. This is what the skeptics are warning us about. Increased taxation, burdensome regulation, bloated government. Now, for the purposes of contrast, let's take this to the extreme. Let's say we end up with massive layoffs caused by draconian regulation, which sparks a recession, which spirals into a depression, which cascades worldwide, and we end up with a global economic depression, which makes the 1930s look like a cakewalk. Okay, how about this scenario where we didn't take action and we didn't need to, so we made the right decision. No big economic consequences, continued prosperity. I'm sure we had some problems, but climate change wasn't one of them. How about this scenario where we did take action on climate change, and it's a good thing too because the doomsayers turned out to be right. Well, we still got the cost associated with that, but in this case it was money well spent because the money and the regulation allowed us to counteract climate change. It still happened, but we managed it. It's a different world, but it's livable. Now how about this scenario over here, where the doomsayers turned out to be right and we didn't take action? Now, since we've granted the extreme up here, we should grant the extreme down here. And in that case, it gets kind of ugly because we've got economic, political, social, environmental, and public health catastrophes on a global scale. This is your worst case scenario. This is the sea level rising 10, 20 feet, entire coastal countries disappearing, hundreds of millions of people worldwide displaced, crowding in on their neighbors, causing widespread warfare over scarce resources and long-standing hatreds. We've got entire forests die and burn, massive droughts alternating with catastrophic floods. We've got the breadbaskets of the USA and Russia turned to dust bowls, causing catastrophic famines, terrible disease epidemics spreading like wildfire, hurricanes like Katrina becoming the norm. I mean, this is a world straight out of science fiction. Economic collapse because the global economy has been hit by crisis after crisis. This is a world that makes Al Gore look like a sissy Pollyanna with no guts who sugar-coated the bad news. Okay, so we've simplified things here a little bit. The clue should be the smiley faces. Any diagram of smiley faces certainly has some complexities underneath. And do this yourself. Add the complexities back in. Use pencil and paper and put some odds in here. Use the, play with the mild cases, not just the extreme cases on both sides. Put in some intermediates in between these dichotomies. And I think you'll see that the following argument still arrives at the same inescapable conclusion. So here's the argument. You can think of it in terms of row thinking versus column thinking. Our future will fall roughly in one of these 4 boxes. Now, because climate change may or may not be real, we cannot know for certain which row the future will lie in. What we can know for certain, because we control it, is which column the future will lie in. So it's a bit like buying a lottery ticket. You buy lottery ticket A or ticket B, and then you sit back and wait to see what the laws of physics deal out as the result on your ticket. So let's say we pick lottery ticket A. At that point, we're determining that our future lies somewhere between a global economic depression and a different but livable world. So here's a scenario where we made a mistake. We acted when we didn't need to. And here's the cost of that mistake, a global economic depression. This is the risk associated with buying lottery ticket A. Well, that sounds like a pretty scary risk, so let's see if we have a better option over here on lottery ticket B. If we pick column B, and it turns out to be the right choice, then hey presto, we're happy. And if it turns out to be a mistake, what would the cost of that mistake be? The end of the world? well, the end of the world as we know it. The globe will still be here, humans will still be here, the species will survive, but this is a very different, much more hostile place. This is the risk associated with picking column B, whether by deliberate choice or, and here's the scary part, by default of inaction because we were busy debating, trying to guess which road the future would land in. Notice that this cost down here, this consequent, incorporates the threat to the economy that this one up here does, but with some added bonus features as well. Also, it gets worse than that because in the last 5 years, we've learned that it's possible, it's plausible, that this might happen abruptly in a very short time period, perhaps as short as a decade or two. So we're not just talking abstract grandchildren here, we're talking you and me. Now, don't take my word for it on this. Don't take anyone's word for it. Do this to yourself. Listen to information on climate change, and when you hear it, ask yourself, are they talking about guessing at rows, or are they talking about choosing between columns? Because I think you'll see that however you construct this, the argument still leads to the same inescapable conclusion, which is this. When faced with uncertainty about our future, the only responsible choice, the only defensible choice, really the only choice is column A in order to eliminate this as a possibility. Because the risk of not acting far outweighs the risk of acting. So, there's my silver bullet argument.
So what do you personally do about it? Well, here's some good news for a change. In fact, it sounds too good to be true because it's stunningly easy. What you do is spread the word. Because the only way we truly get into column A is changes in public policy, and those only change when enough people demand it. So you do what you can to spread an understanding of this argument and to increase public demand for column A. You make this part of your thinking, part of your conversations, and you forward this video on to others so it changes their thinking. And then they forward it to others, and they forward it to still others. Imagine that. Because in today's information age, you can change the culture. You can help change public policy. And remarkably, sometimes just a few mouse clicks is all it takes to start an avalanche. So I'm asking you, whom I've never met but whose fate I'm still tied to, if you think I'm wrong, please tell me where, politely. And if you can't find an error in my reasoning or my assumptions, then help spread the word. Talk about this. Forward it to others. Because anything less, and intentionally or not, we're choosing column B. Why does that terrify me? Because we only get to play this game once. Think it won't happen? Maybe. How lucky do you feel?
As a context, I think this fellow's done an excellent job on his presentation, and there's a lot of parallels with what I want to talk about tonight. One of them is that we're really talking about how you as the community leaders think about changes in public policy that will result in the future that you want to see. We can't, with any knowledge, know what the future will be, but we can control events to try to steer it to a future that we would like. Right now, I'm arguing that we're headed to a future that we definitely won't like, and it's based on decisions that have been made many decades ago and that haven't been changed. So in thinking about the complexity of this issue and how to make it simple, Ted and I were discussing the issue of urban sprawl and what do we mean. And I think in most people's context, if you fly over Calgary or you fly over Los Angeles or you look at the houses on the hill in